During a live broadcast of a public values forum held at the Capitol, a gathering meant to foster dialogue between cultural leaders, an unexpected confrontation stunned the nation. The air was thick, the silence between words sharp enough to cut through steel. But what no one saw coming was how Jonathan Roumie responded. No outrage, no raised voice, just one calm, deliberate sentence that shifted the entire energy of the room and left even the most hardened viewers holding their breath. Let's go back. The event was being streamed live across the country. Students, pastors, activists, and everyday citizens tuned in. The room was filled with tension, like a chapel before a storm. Restless papers, shifting postures, cautious glances. A sense of reckoning hovered in the air. Jonathan Roumie, invited to speak on the intersection of faith and public life, had been calmly discussing the moral weight of leadership and the importance of humility in service. But then, from across the stage, political commentator Tucker Carlson leaned forward, his voice coated with sarcasm. "Why don't you sit down, preacher boy? We're here for policy, not parables." The words fell like a stone in a still lake. They weren't just mocking, they were meant to humiliate. The audience froze. Even the camera stuttered for a moment, unsure whether to zoom in or fade out. Roumie didn't blink. He didn't shift in his chair or flinch with offense. He simply set his note card on the table, folded his hands, and met Tucker's glare with unwavering peace. Then he spoke, gently but with piercing clarity. "I was invited here not to entertain cynicism, but to remind us that conscience belongs in every room we enter, even this one." Silence. Then something unexpected. Scattered slow applause. Not loud, not performative, but real. Like people realizing they had just witnessed a clean counterpunch delivered without malice. Just truth. Tucker tried to smirk, but his eyes betrayed discomfort. He leaned back, pretending to scan his notes. The power had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it. Outside the chamber, the internet erupted. Clips flooded social media. Tucker Carlson tries to mock Jonathan Roumie, gets humbled with grace. TV stations dropped their scheduled segments. Faith communities, youth leaders, and even seasoned journalists began replaying the clip, dissecting that one sentence. Jonathan didn't bask in the moment. He simply picked up his note card again, looked toward the moderator and said, "If I may, I'd like to continue." And in doing so, he reminded the world, you don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to strike to shift the ground beneath your feet. Sometimes the strongest voice is the one that stays still and speaks only when it matters. By late afternoon, social media was ablaze, not with arguments over policy, but with a single 35-second video. Jonathan Roumie, calm and composed, looking directly at Tucker Carlson and delivering a line that cut deeper than any shout ever could. The clip of his graceful yet piercing response had already surpassed 800,000 views within hours, and the numbers kept rising. News networks looped it endlessly. On MSNBC, commentators unpacked the deeper meaning behind Tucker's remark. "Let's not pretend it was just snark," one host said. That was a power play, and Roumie dismantled it without ever raising his voice. Even CNN's typically restrained panel described the moment as a masterclass in grace under fire. But it wasn't just the media that felt it. It was people, ordinary people, teachers, clerks, nurses, veterans, people who'd been interrupted mid-thought, who'd been dismissed because they chose peace over aggression. A teacher in Boise wrote online, "I've been sit-down preacher boy in so many meetings." His response? "That's how you hold ground." A grandmother in Tulsa posted, "My mother wasn't allowed to speak in public meetings. Today, I saw a man answer contempt with calm, and I cried." Back in Roumie's modest office, his team sat in silence, stunned by what they'd just witnessed unfold across the country. Aides paced, phones buzzed with media requests, from The Breakfast Club, Essence, even a producer from Jon Stewart's team. "Is Jon Stewart still doing a show?" Roumie asked, half smiling. "No," one aide chuckled, "but his people want you on their podcast." Roumie turned to the window, sunlight pooling on his jacket sleeve. "Let them wait. I'll speak, but not for headlines. When I do, it'll be for those who've been dismissed by that tone. Not for claps, for clarity." Meanwhile, Tucker Carlson's team issued a brief statement downplaying the public reaction as overblown. They urged people to move on, but the words fell flat. That night, at a previously scheduled scholarship ceremony in Baton Rouge, Roumie kept his promise and showed up. He wasn't there to talk about the viral moment, but of course, it followed him. After the event, a girl approached him, her voice shaking. My grandma called me crying today. She said she never thought she'd see someone answer like that. Not yelling, not retreating, just strong. Roumie rested a hand on her shoulder, eyes steady. You don't always have to be calm. Just know when not to let someone take your strength. That line would become known as the Roumie Declaration. It wasn't loud. It didn't come from a podium, but it echoed, and the echo grew. By sunset in San Diego, versions of the clip had exploded across TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram. Some paired it with gospel choirs, others with violins, or even fireworks. One creator slowed down the video and added a caption, "This is how a man of faith holds the line." That version alone had over 2 million views by midnight. In Nevada, a political cartoonist illustrated the moment. Jonathan standing calm at a podium, haloed by camera lights, while Tucker Carlson was shown tangled in his own microphone cord. The caption, "When you try to silence someone, but only amplify their truth." The hashtags #StandWithGrace and #VoiceOverVolume began trending worldwide. People flooded comment sections with their own stories. From PTA meetings to boardrooms, they wrote of times they were belittled, talked over, or mocked with condescending tones. A woman tweeted, "I run a company, I own 2 degrees, and last week during a budget meeting, a man I'd never met called me sweetheart." Watching Roumie's face, that was me, that was all of us. Celebrities began chiming in. Kerry Washington posted a quote from Roumie's response, "Conscience belongs in every room we enter." It got 100,000 likes. Shonda Rhimes shared the clip with a single word, dignity. But it wasn't the viral reach that made the moment matter. It was who kept sharing it. Single mothers, veterans, pastors, factory workers, high schoolers. They weren't chasing drama. They were finally seeing something they'd never seen spoken out loud before. BuzzFeed, which rarely covers such forums, ran a headline the next morning. Jonathan Roumie just gave America a lesson in power without noise. And it was only the beginning. The cut called it the most powerful 2 seconds in public discourse this year. In Washington, Jonathan Roumie's team was caught completely off guard. The digital staff had to triple their server capacity just to handle the volume of incoming messages. Some came from major news outlets, but most didn't. They came from ordinary people. Letters, emails, voice notes. A woman from Columbus said she hadn't watched the news in 2 years, until her daughter showed her the clip. "I cried," she wrote, "because someone finally responded the way we all wish we could." A retired Navy officer said bluntly, "Sir, I don't share your beliefs, but I respect what you did. You didn't escalate. You just stood firm, and that matters." Of course, not all the reactions were supportive. This was the internet. Some pundits called it drama or performance. Others tried to downplay its importance or label it scripted theater. But those takes didn't stick, because people knew what they had seen, and more importantly, they knew what it meant. Meanwhile, the next morning, Tucker Carlson posted a photo on the Capitol steps. His caption spoke of fighting for truth and freedom, but the comments underneath were relentless. Not mean? Not mean, but piercing. Still think calling a man of faith preacher boy was a good idea? Was that supposed to be friendly, or did you just assume no one would call you out? Tucker said nothing, and that silence said everything. The damage wasn't just in what he said, it was in what it revealed. About himself, and about the kind of dismissiveness people are tired of excusing. And Roumie? He still hadn't given a single interview, no press tour, no fiery posts. He let the moment breathe, letting people sit with what they'd witnessed. That evening, he kept a promise, one made months earlier. He attended a small community meeting in Atlanta, held in a basement rec room with 40 folding chairs and a table of coffee and donuts. Mostly older women, teachers, and organizers. When he entered, the room stood and clapped. One woman, her voice trembling, said, "We saw what you did, and sir, you did it for all of us." Roumie nodded, his voice steady. "I didn't do it for applause. I did it because someone had to." While social media swirled, another conversation was beginning. Quiet, deep, and far from the glare of headlines. Because behind the viral quote, beyond the edited clips, Jonathan Roumie wasn't a celebrity moment. He was a mirror. A man raised not in wealth or fame, but in conviction. His mother, a teacher with a firm spirit and rosary beads in her coat pocket, taught him that dignity starts with how you treat others, even when they don't return it. His father, a soft-spoken laborer with paint-splattered boots, rarely raised his voice but always knew who did the real work and who needed defending. Jonathan grew up not in power but in principle. In high school, he was the kid who raised his hand too often, not to talk but to ask why. Why were students with accents laughed at? Why did faith have to be mocked to be taken seriously? At college, he majored in communications, but spent weekends leading local outreach for at-risk youth. He didn't look for stages. He looked for spaces where his presence could mean something. And yet one day someone told him, "You should speak publicly." People would listen. He laughed at first, but the idea stayed. So when that moment with Tucker happened, it wasn't new for him. It was just the first time the world saw how he responds. Back in Atlanta after the meeting, a local organizer named Miss Clara clasped his hand. "You reminded them of something they forgot, how real strength speaks." He nodded, eyes lowered in reverence. "I only said what people like you taught me. Stand up when the moment asks you to." As for Tucker, he kept trying to control the story. He appeared at events, shifted focus back to policy, avoided the subject. But the public wasn't looking his way. Their eyes were still on Roumie. Some of Tucker's colleagues even distanced themselves, wary of being caught in the crossfire of something they couldn't control. And Jonathan? He didn't get distracted by the spotlight. He stayed steady, reading letters, attending small events, and drafting a new proposal for value-based curriculum in schools. He told his aide Ethan, "If we teach kids respect early, maybe fewer adults will think they can mock someone's faith without consequences." Because for Roumie, it was never just about defending himself. It was about reminding the country what grace looks like when it refuses to back down. Jonathan Roumie never forgot where he came from. On his desk, tucked between a prayer card and a leather-bound journal, sat a small framed photo. His mother, Maria, wearing her hospital scrubs, holding infant Jonathan in her arms. Both were smiling, gazing at something just out of frame. On tough days, Jonathan would look at that photo and remember why he was here. When Tucker Carlson had told him to "sit down, preacher boy," it hadn't just been an insult. It was a memory of every time he'd been told he was too soft, too earnest, too spiritual to belong in spaces that prize sharp elbows over open hands. A reminder that for some, calm conviction is mistaken for weakness, especially when it comes from someone whose strength is quiet. But Roumie knew those rooms. He wasn't new to them. He was raised in them. He knew who he was. And those who had underestimated him were only just beginning to realize the ground was shifting. The next morning, Capitol Hill was buzzing, but not about any legislation. Producers scrambled behind the studio sets. Morning shows scrapped economic updates to ask the same question. Will Jonathan Roumie respond? MSNBC debuted a segment called "The Power of Stillness." Fox News tried to brush it off as overblown theatrics. CNN assembled a panel of commentators, left, right, and center, each circling the same conclusion. This doesn't look good for Tucker Carlson. Roumie, however, said nothing. No press tour, no live stream, no triumphant speech. His office released only a single statement, so gentle it felt handwritten. "My words yesterday weren't prepared. They reflect lived experience, mine and many others. I'll always speak up for dignity, not for noise, not for sides, just for what's right." And that clarity, stripped of spin, rang louder than any political monologue. By noon, the White House press secretary addressed it, calling the moment an unfortunate exchange and praising Roumie's measured professionalism. Meanwhile, Tucker's office struggled. A leaked memo revealed that his advisors urged him to call the insult a joke or offer a vague apology. But Tucker refused. Pride won out. One of his closest allies, Representative Tyler Grayson, tried to downplay it in a radio interview. "This is all a distraction." But even the host cut in. "With respect, Congressman, the public didn't see a distraction. They saw a revelation." Tucker continued posting, as if nothing had happened. A picture with veterans, a comment on inflation, a vague caption, "We stay resilient." But every comment looped back. It's not about resilience. It's about listening. And the worst blow? Silence from his usual supporters. Even casual replays of the clip didn't soften its sting. If anything, the more people watched it, the clearer it became who had held power and who had tried to fake it. Jonathan didn't respond. He didn't need to. He didn't need defending either. Even his allies understood that. One quiet message came from Representative Calvin Porter, a veteran lawmaker who rarely weighed in on media firestorms. "You handled that with grace," he said in a voicemail. "We all saw it, and it wasn't just about you, it was about all of us." In his office, Roumie's aide Riley was sorting through dozens of media requests. "NPR wants you in studio," she said. Roumie just shook his head. "Not yet. We let the message land on its own terms." And it was. His name began trending. Invitations flooded in, from The View, PBS NewsHour, Morehouse, CBS Sunday Morning. He gathered his staff around a coffee table. "Everyone wants a headline," he said, "but if we speak, it'll be on our terms." Meanwhile, Tucker Carlson tried to stay visible. He appeared at an event in Richmond, talked policy, avoided questions, but no one was really watching. The focus had shifted. Even some of his peers began avoiding him, not wanting to be dragged into the fallout. Roumie didn't gloat. He returned to his work, traveling, speaking, listening. At a workshop in Birmingham, an older woman raised her hand and said, "I was called boy once at 50. When I saw you answer without flinching, I saw myself." Roumie nodded. "Stories like yours," he said, "are why I stood still." What began as a moment had become a movement. In Philadelphia, students launched a Hold the Line initiative, encouraging young men and women to share stories of holding their ground with dignity. In Denver, a teacher showed the clip in class to talk about moral courage and self-respect. Roumie received hundreds of letters. Kids, elders, pastors, skeptics. He read each one. Some he tucked into a small wooden box on his desk, beneath that old photo of his mother. Then he got to work. He began drafting a proposal with bipartisan support, focused on value-based education in public schools, teaching kids about dignity, listening, and the power of restraint. He said to Riley, "If we teach kids how to see worth in others early, maybe fewer adults will think mocking someone's faith or calm is strength." And she nodded. "So what's the plan?" Roumie turned to the window, looking out over the Capitol. "We wait, then we speak. Not for cameras, for the people who've lived it." The team agreed, but the media was growing impatient. They didn't like silence. Meanwhile, Tucker Carlson's name began appearing in op-eds with titles like "When Tough Talk Turns Empty," "The Echo of Mockery," "What Happens When Performance Reveals Insecurity." And Jonathan? He just kept showing up. Because stillness doesn't mean silence, and real strength doesn't perform, it persists. In Georgia, Jonathan Roumie's office began receiving more than just emails, flowers, handwritten notes, even a USB drive from a high school debate coach labeled, "Hold the Line, for the ones who listen." Even Roumie's political critics began treading carefully. They understood this wasn't just a media blip, it was a turning point. It showed what happens when someone tries to diminish a person who already knows his worth. 3 days after the panel that changed everything, Jonathan kept a prior commitment, a quiet visit to a girls' leadership program in Montgomery, Alabama. There were no cameras, no stage, no podium, just a small gym, a folding chair, a mic on a stand, and rows of girls eager to meet the man who had stood his ground without shouting. Jonathan wore a simple sweater, jeans, and worn-in boots. He didn't walk in like a celebrity. He walked in like someone who'd lived the moment they'd all been talking about. He began softly. I wasn't shocked by what he said. I was familiar with it. I've heard versions of it my whole life. He spoke not from notes but from memory. Stories of being misunderstood, dismissed for being too soft, laughed at for centering kindness, told to man up in rooms that didn't know what real manhood meant. A girl raised her hand. "Did it hurt?" she asked. Roumie nodded gently. "Not really, because he wasn't talking to me. He was talking to his idea of me." The room was silent, not with tension, but with recognition. Afterward, the girls gathered around him. One wanted to be a lawyer, another was running for student council president. Jonathan listened to each like they were already leaders, because in his eyes, they were. Meanwhile, in Washington, Tucker Carlson was unraveling under quiet pressure. Some of his longtime allies began criticizing him publicly. He appeared on a late-night show, pivoting hard to policy, trying to reframe the conversation. He called it a misunderstood moment. The audience didn't buy it. They kept asking about Jonathan. Back in Atlanta, Roumie didn't clap back. He simply channeled the momentum into action, partnering with nonprofits to launch youth leadership programs, hosting online workshops that united thousands of women and men around the value of calm power, accepting an invitation to speak at an international conference on dignity and education. In a meeting with his team, he said, "We don't just teach kids to read and write, we have to teach them how to see others' worth." The hashtag Hold the Line movement kept spreading. In Los Angeles, a group of women created a scholarship in his name to support students entering law, public service, and faith-based advocacy. Jonathan never sought the spotlight, but he had learned to use it with intention. Tucker Carlson, still in office, never quite regained public trust. He stopped appearing at public events, focused more on closed-door initiative. Some thought he was buying time for a comeback. Others believed the moment had fundamentally changed him, or at least exposed what lay underneath. After the Montgomery talk, an elderly volunteer named Ruth pulled Jonathan aside. "I've been doing this for 30 years, she said, and I've never seen those girls sit so still. You gave them something we couldn't. You showed them how to hold their ground without hardening their hearts." Jonathan smiled and gripped her hand. "It's the only way I know." That night, grainy phone footage of the talk began spreading across TikTok and Instagram. No filters, no edits, just raw presence. One comment summed it up. "He's not speaking from a pedestal. He's speaking like he's been where we are." Jonathan's communications team didn't post anything. They didn't need to. The moment was speaking for itself. Behind the scenes, Washington had started to shift. The Congressional Black Caucus reached out in support. A senator from Arizona called Jonathan personally. "I didn't grasp how deep this was until I saw you speak to those girls." That was the power now. Not in the clip, but in the authenticity that echoed beyond it. 3 days later, in a quiet conference room on Capitol Hill, 4 lawmakers, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans sat together. Representative Amos Carver from Wyoming leaned forward. "That clip's not going away." No one disagreed. They'd seen the public reaction, and they knew this moment was reshaping the political landscape. That afternoon, back in Atlanta, Roumie's aide Riley walked into his office. "You won't believe this. Tucker Carlson's office wants a private meeting, no press." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "He's trying to save face." Riley paused. "Or maybe someone just told him this won't go away." Jonathan thought for a moment, then replied, "Fine, but he comes here." 3 hours later, Tucker Carlson walked into Jonathan Roumie's office, alone. No aides, no cameras, no script. Jonathan remained seated behind his desk, calm, unbothered. Tucker began, "I'm not here to argue, I want to explain." Jonathan gestured quietly to the chair across from him. The air was heavy, but not hostile. Tucker spoke about pressure, expectations, pride. He didn't apologize, but he did admit, "My tone was wrong." Jonathan didn't interrupt. He didn't sharpen his words. He listened. Then he spoke, only once. "I don't care about your intent. I care about your impact. Because your words didn't just try to dismiss me. They diminished everyone who's ever been told their calm doesn't count. And you knew that." Tucker didn't argue. He just nodded, slowly. Because even pride recognizes when it's been eclipsed by something stronger. Stillness that speaks. Tucker Carlson nodded, slowly. He didn't argue, didn't deflect. "I get it," he said. "I'm not here to fix everything, but I want to start somewhere." He sat down across from Jonathan Roumie, visibly uneasy, not nervous, just unfamiliar with this kind of room, this kind of silence. He took a breath. "I said something I shouldn't have. It came out wrong." Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "It didn't just come out, Tucker. It came from somewhere, and there's a difference." Tucker started to respond, then stopped. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded." Jonathan's voice remained steady. "So, what did you mean?" A long pause. Finally, Tucker answered, "I wanted to make a point. You were interrupting. I had the floor." Jonathan nodded once. "Tucker," he said, leaning forward gently, "it wasn't just dismissive to me. It was dismissive to everyone who's ever been silenced in a room where they belonged." That night, a clip from Roumie's recent talk in Montgomery continued to spread quietly but powerfully online. Unedited, handheld, real. People commented not on the lighting or delivery, but the authenticity. "He doesn't talk like a pundit," one woman wrote. "He talks like he's been there." Jonathan's office never reposted it. They didn't have to. The moment had a life of its own. In Washington, quiet conversations began. The Congressional Black Caucus reached out in support. A senator from Arizona called Roumie directly. "I didn't understand the weight of it until I saw how you spoke to those girls." Lawmakers from both parties began meeting behind closed doors. In one of those rooms, Representative Amos Carver said plainly, "That clip's not going away." No one disagreed. They understood this was no longer about one exchange. It was about the cultural temperature of the country. Later that week, Roumie's aide Riley returned to his office. "You're not going to believe this. Carlson's office just called. He wants a second meeting. This time, no cameras, no spin." Jonathan looked out the window, reflecting. "He's trying to save face." Riley shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe someone finally told him, this isn't going to fade." Jonathan thought for a beat, then replied, "Fine, but he comes here." 3 hours later, Tucker arrived, alone again. No media, no aides, just a man walking into the weight of his own actions. Jonathan greeted him with quiet composure. "I'm not asking for an apology," he said. "I want you to think about it. This job we do, It's not performance. People listen. Tucker stared at the floor. I get it now. When he left, Jonathan didn't shake his hand. He simply turned to Riley and said, he's shaken, but that's not my burden to carry. No press release followed, no leaks. But at the next public event, Tucker Carlson didn't interrupt anyone. He stayed quiet. The room noticed. Change had begun. Meanwhile, Jonathan Roumie moved forward. He and his team began drafting a formal resolution, not as retaliation, but as a foundation. The respect and presence in public discourse. Resolution, it focused on professional conduct in televised forums, training on cultural humility and listening, guidelines for respectful cross-belief dialogue. He wasn't trying to punish anyone. He was trying to leave something better behind. In Savannah, at a local gathering, a mother pulled him aside. My daughter watches your clip every day. She says, I want to be strong like him, without yelling. Jonathan smiled. That's the whole point. The movement grew. Schools invited him to speak. Women's groups reached out. A podcast launched called Quiet Fire, dedicated to reclaiming dignity in discourse. He pushed forward the Respect Education Act, built with lawmakers from both sides of the aisle. Education, he told a hearing, isn't just about knowledge, it's about values. If we don't teach kids respect, we're handing them problems they won't know how to solve. One evening back in Atlanta after a long day, Roumie sat alone in his office. He looked at the photo of his mother, the same one from his desk, her arms wrapped around him, both of them beaming. He thought about his journey, from a quiet boy told to toughen up, to a man reminding the nation that silence isn't surrender, that power doesn't always raise its voice. 2 weeks later, Roumie stood in front of a packed legislative floor, phones out, cameras ready, but Roumie didn't perform. He didn't raise his voice. He simply read, clear, precise, unapologetic. This resolution isn't a reprimand. It's a mirror, one we all need to look into. When he finished, the room was silent. Then, applause. Not explosive, but genuine. That night, Jonathan called his mother. I saw every second, she said. It was like thunder, quiet thunder. In the days that followed, 8,000 plus messages flooded in, mostly from young people. One read, I want to be strong like you, but not rude. At a panel discussion, someone asked him, do you think that moment with Carlson really changed anything? Jonathan paused, then smiled. I think it woke people up. And once awake, you can't put them back to sleep. Meanwhile, Tucker Carlson began adjusting his approach. He spoke more carefully, focused on policy, worked closely with advisors to rebuild his image. Some noted the shift, but many also noted this truth. Trust, once lost, doesn't return easily. The Hold the Line movement kept growing. Organizations emerged to support young people learning to lead with integrity. Jonathan Roumie's name became more than a moment. It became a message woven into classrooms and community centers across the country. Roumie continued his work quietly, supporting outreach efforts, listening to communities, refining the Respect Education Act. In a team meeting, he said, education isn't just teaching kids to read, it's teaching them to value people. Though Tucker Carlson wasn't publicly involved in the resolution, he quietly backed similar initiatives. Some people gave him credit for the shift, but skepticism lingered. Jonathan didn't dwell on Tucker's choices. He stayed focused on his own calling. Then an invitation arrived, an International Human Dignity and Education Conference in London. Jonathan was asked to be a keynote speaker. He told his aide Ethan, every step forward starts with someone choosing to stand, not with volume, but with vision. One evening in Atlanta after a long day, Roumie sat in his office. He opened a letter from a 15-year-old girl in Birmingham. I used to think I wasn't good enough to speak up, but you made me believe I can. Jonathan smiled, folded the letter, and placed it in the wooden box beside his mother's photo. He knew this wasn't about a bill or a headline. It was about helping others write their own story and believe they deserved to. 6 months later, on a cold morning in Columbus, Georgia, a public school called Riverfront Academy held a modest debate showcase. Plastic chairs, folding tables, a borrowed podium. But for the students, it wasn't just an event. It was a turning point. The topic was power and presence, how we use our voice. A 13-year-old girl named Naya Carter stepped to the microphone, gripping a folded paper. She looked nervous, but when she spoke, she did so with fire and focus that stunned the room. I was chosen to represent my values, my community, and every girl who's been told to shrink herself to make others comfortable. She then quoted Roumie's testimony on the House floor. Teachers clapped, some through tears. I don't want to shout to be heard, Naya finished. I just want my voice to matter. Jonathan never knew about that speech, but that's the quiet miracle of legacy. It echoes in rooms you've never entered, through voices you've never met. Back in Washington, Roumie's bill hadn't passed in full, but it shifted the ground. Committees updated guidelines. Chairs started paying more attention to tone. Meetings implemented new codes of conduct. Change came slowly, but it came. Jonathan kept working. Late nights, local visits, small-town panels, not for fame, for duty. What had changed wasn't just legislation. It was how others saw him and how they saw themselves. One young staffer said, "I wore my natural curls to work today because of you." A Republican aide admitted, "My boss changed how he addresses women in meetings because of what you did." Tucker Carlson, he never apologized, but he never used that tone again. Whether from regret or calculation, it didn't matter. The line had been drawn. At an airport, a woman who once disagreed with Roumie stopped him. "How you handled that made me rethink what real strength looks like." Later, Jonathan scribbled something on a napkin. "Rethink what strength is." That wasn't a quote, it was a legacy. He kept hosting workshops, kept walking into rooms others ignored, kept listening to the voices long talked over. One girl, once afraid of being too intense, told him, "You made me see, that's a good thing." The Hold the Line campaign reached from Chicago classrooms to Denver scholarships. Thank you letters kept coming. Tucker gradually regained a slice of credibility, focusing on housing and avoiding confrontation. He stayed quieter, more precise. Some believe the moment matured him. Jonathan didn't speculate. He had work to do. He continued refining the education bill, expanding leadership initiatives for youth, and preparing his keynote for London. "We're not just changing laws," he told Ethan. "We're changing how people see each other." One night in Atlanta, Jonathan opened another letter. It was from Naya, the girl from Columbus. "I won my debate because of you. I didn't shout, but they still listened." He smiled and tucked the letter beside the others. He knew then, this wasn't about a speech or a policy or a platform. This was about girls like Nia, learning to stand up without asking permission. When the next congressional session began, Jonathan Roumie co-sponsored 3 new bills on education, maternal health access, and housing equity. He didn't ride the wave of his moment. He built something lasting beneath it. At a small panel in Mobile, Alabama, someone asked, "Do you feel like your moment has passed?" He smiled. "Moments pass, movements don't. If I leave behind even one sentence that helps someone stand a little taller, then I've done my job." Before his story closed, Jonathan Roumie wanted to leave behind one more message, a note for anyone who had ever been told to sit down when they knew they were right to stand. There was no media, no lights, just a modest town hall in Augusta, Georgia. Rows of folding chairs, a wooden podium, and a room full of people, barbers, teachers, pastors, students, volunteers, single moms. This wasn't a speech, it was a gathering of truth. Roumie adjusted the microphone slightly and looked out over the crowd. "Let me tell you why I keep showing up," he began. "Because one sentence can shift a room, but showing up, again and again, that's what changes the world." In the back row, an elderly woman leaned over and whispered to her granddaughter, "Listen close." Jonathan continued, his voice calm, firm, but full. What happened that day wasn't just about one person being disrespected. It was about a culture that teaches us who's worthy of being heard and who should stay quiet. He paused. I wasn't surprised by what was said to me. I've heard it before, but this time I was done letting it slide. And I think a lot of you are too. Heads nodded slowly. Because nearly everyone in that room had their own version of that moment. A time they were told to lower their voice, to not make a scene, to stay in their place. Roumie raised his eyes. "When I said I was here to stand, I wasn't just talking about interviews or politics. I meant every space that tries to make you shrink. Every waiting room, classroom, boardroom, dinner table." He pivoted slightly on his heel. "Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable the world gets when someone refuses to make themselves small?" He smiled gently. "That discomfort, it's not your burden to carry, it's theirs to confront." Applause broke out, slow and steady. Then he leaned in slightly. "Some of you may never be on a stage or write a bill. That's okay, but I promise you, your voice still matters. In your home, in your job, at your child's school, at the ballot box. Use it." A young woman up front raised her hand, notebook on her lap. "How do you keep speaking when they keep trying to silence you?" Jonathan gave a soft, knowing smile. "You remember who you were before they told you to be quiet." The room murmured in agreement. I'm not perfect, he added. I'm not a saint, but I know why I'm here. And every time I choose to speak without shouting, to stand without performing, to respond without apologizing for who I am, that's a win. He paused. I'll still think power is just volume, but I've learned something different. Real power is knowing when to speak, what to say, and standing still long enough to let it echo. And then one final line. If you've ever been told to sit down when you knew you were right to stand, remember this. You weren't sent here to be silent. You were sent to make a difference. Act like it. The room erupted in applause. Not loud, but grounded. Not performance, just truth meeting truth. After the meeting, people crowded around him, sharing their own stories. A mother spoke of her daughter running for student council. A retired man said he'd finally started attending city meetings. A girl said she no longer apologized for her passion. Jonathan listened to each story one by one, mentally tucking them away like fuel. He didn't linger. He shook a few hands, shared a few hugs, took a couple of photos, then slipped out the back door into the quiet Georgia night. Outside, beneath street lamps, he paused beside his car, pulled out his phone, opened his notes app, typed, "One sentence can go viral, but one stand, that's forever." He looked back once at the small town hall. He thought of the faces inside, those who nodded, whispered, and stood a little taller. They hadn't just heard it, they'd felt it. This moment wasn't about him, it was about them, people learning to stand tall in their own lives. And he smiled, knowing the fire he'd sparked had spread far beyond Augusta. The story of Jonathan Roumie, his calm defiance, his stand for dignity, and his ripple of influence, reflects something profound about the world we live in. In an era dominated by outrage and noise, he reminded us that the loudest voice isn't always the one that leads. From choosing stillness in the face of mockery to building movements rooted in values, he modeled something rare: clarity over combat, conviction over volume, grace over spectacle. As he once told Carlson, "I don't care about intent, I care about impact." And in that line lies the heartbeat of his legacy. Because from town halls to classrooms, from hashtags to handwritten notes, from young girls in Birmingham to lawmakers on Capitol Hill, he reminded people that power isn't what you take, it's how you carry it. If there's a final lesson, it's this: stand up for your values, but do it with respect. Speak with purpose, not with ego. And keep showing up, even when no one's watching. Because that's how the future gets built. Not with noise, but with courage, consistency, and quiet fire. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own voice, or of someone you know who's been told to stay silent, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel to follow more stories that empower, inspire, and remind us that real strength doesn't always shout. It stands steady. Your voice matters. Your presence matters. And your next step might just change everything. We'll see you in the next video.